How many discounts does USAA Auto Insurance offer? Too many to say here. Multi-vehicle discount, safe driver discount, new vehicle discount, storage discount, legacy.
How many
discount,
discounts will you stack up? Tap the banner or visit usaa.com/auto discounts. Restrictions apply.
As a chef, I know flavor doesn't begin in the kitchen. It begins on the land. And Westhome's nature-led Australian Wagyu is a story written in the landscape of Northern Australia. Cooking is storytelling, and Westhome Wagyu carries a story of Northern Australia itself. Raw, powerful, and deeply authentic. It's a testament to the passion and care raised in the rhythm of Northern Australia. I'm Chef Maylin from 88 Club in Los Angeles, and I invite you to visit westhome.com/Maylin to learn more and taste a story only Westhome nature-led Australian Wagyu can tell. That's westhome.com/MEILIN.
What if you're feeling like a fraud because you're performing an expert instead of becoming one? Welcome back to Speaking with Confidence, the podcast that helps you build the soft skills that lead to real results. Communication, storytelling, public speaking, and showing up with confidence in every conversation that counts. I'm Tim Newman, a recovering college professor turned communication coach, and I'm thrilled to guide you on a journey to becoming a powerful communicator. The expert facade is a trap. Most people think failure is just the opposite of success. But that's a total lie we've all been fed for years. And this feels especially heavy for Gen Z because every mistake seems like it's going on a permanent record or a LinkedIn feed for the whole world to see. I want you to hear the truth that nobody actually teaches, which is that your biggest failure is not an endpoint at all. It's actually a forced pivot and a piece of data from the universe that you could never have bought on your own. I'm going to walk you through a simple 3-part system called the pivot protocol to help you turn any screw up into a strategic advantage. And this has nothing to do with toxic positivity. And instead, we're looking at a cold, hard communication strategy. I got 2 quick stories to show you how this works in the real world. The first story is much bigger than the second one. And I know some of you may have already heard this. It happened back in college when I had to give my first speech. I was so incredibly nervous that I threw up in front of the class. I couldn't really hide the evidence, but I hid my embarrassment, and that affected me for a long time. The second story is not nearly as serious and happened recently, but you wouldn't expect something like this to happen at all. A few weeks ago, I went to give blood, and I was being me. I was joking around and connecting with the staff, and the nurse asked me to spell my name out loud. No problem. I said, T-I-M. She said, no, spell your full legal name. My mind went completely blank, and I actually spelled my own first name wrong. How embarrassing, right? Wrong. We all had a good laugh and moved on. You see, in the second scenario, I didn't try to hide the embarrassment because I wasn't embarrassed. I accept that as a human, I'm going to say silly things sometimes. And my point here is this, that trying to keep up that facade is a trap that stops you from learning. And today, we're going to break it. We are basically wired to see failure as part of our identity instead of just a piece of information. When you mess up a project at work, your brain starts screaming that you're a failure rather than realizing that a specific approach just didn't work. This mindset is brutal when you're working in teams or trying to get a boss to trust you because you become defensive and stop sharing new ideas. Everything becomes about protecting your image, and that's exactly when you stop making any real progress. John Maxwell has a great concept called failing forward that explains the difference between tuition payments and tragic errors. He says a tuition payment is a failure that teaches you something vital. In other words, you paid a price but walked away with a real education. On the other hand, a tragic error happens when you make the same mistake repeatedly and pay the price without ever learning the lesson. That speech where I got sick was a massive tuition payment for me because I learned more about authentic connection in that moment than I ever did from a polished talk. My classmates didn't care about my perfect points, but they definitely remember the guy who was human enough to be terrified and did the work. Well, the next time around anyway. That failure proved that authenticity beats perfection every single time. Yet we usually miss that insight because we are too busy feeling embarrassed. We often hide our mistakes because we think they communicate weakness. But that secrecy is what actually creates a communication breakdown. Your team cannot help you if they don't know what went wrong, and your boss will think everything is fine until the situation suddenly explodes. When you bottle up that data, you basically guarantee that you have to pay that expensive tuition all over again. The real problem is never the failure itself, but rather our refusal to dig into the mess and find out what it is actually worth. So how do you actually get started with this? You need a clean, clinical, and completely emotion-free dissection of what went wrong. Step 1 of the pivot protocol is the autopsy. This is the part where you take that dead project, the botched presentation, or even the misspelled name, and lay it out on the table without any of the emotional baggage. You have to chase the failure for the data rather than the outcome. This is exactly what Ryan Leake talks about in his book, Chasing Failure, where he explains that you aren't chasing the feeling of messing up, but rather the specific insight that the mistake reveals. The goal here is to ask one simple question. What did this reveal? You have to avoid asking, whose fault is this? Because the blame question shuts down your ability to learn, while the revelation question opens everything up. Let's look back at my blood bank story, where I somehow managed to spell my own name wrong. If I just ask myself why I'm so stupid, I get absolutely nowhere. But the moment I ask what that moment revealed, things get a lot more interesting. It showed me that under even the lowest stakes pressure, just a nurse holding a clipboard, my brain completely short-circuited with something fundamental. My automatic and casual response of just saying, Tim, wasn't enough. And that mistake revealed a tiny crack in my composure when dealing with administrative pressure. That isn't just an embarrassing story. It's data and a tuition payment for my future self. Here is a practical framework you can use for postmortem by asking 3 specific questions in a very particular order. First, you ask what the intended result was, which in my case was just trying to answer the questions correctly. Second, you can look at what actually happened, like me misspelling my name and trying to laugh it off. And third, you figure out what the gap between those two things reveals, which taught me that my default response to minor bureaucratic pressure is to use humor to deflect from my errors. This process isn't about making you feel bad, but it's entirely about pattern recognition. When you have the data in front of you, the emotional weight starts to lift because you aren't a person who failed anymore. You're a detective who just found a vital clue. Now that you have the data from the autopsy, you have to move to the next phase. Most people stop right here because they think they've learned their lesson, and they just try to never repeat the same mistake again. But that is a total waste of perfectly good failure. Step 2 is the extraction. And this is where you find the unconventional or strategic insight that only this specific failure could have handed you. You are looking for the opening that a success would have kept hidden from you. When everything goes right, you just get a pat on the back and a confirmation of what you already knew, but you never get a brand new path. In my vomiting story, the extraction wasn't the obvious realization that public speaking is scary, since any minor success could have told me that. The real extraction was realizing that the fastest way to build a genuine connection with an audience is to reveal a human flaw rather than trying to project polished expertise. And that failure forced me to be authentic in a way I never would have chosen on my own. And it showed me that my desire to be seen as the expert was actually the biggest barrier to connecting with people. And the reality is, it took me a while to figure this out. But the result was that I stopped trying to be the smartest guy in the room and started trying to be the most useful, which was a complete strategic pivot extracted from a moment of total humiliation. You are essentially turning the thought, I messed up, into a realization that you discovered exactly what doesn't work, which points you toward what might. The communication shift here moves you from being defensive to being wildly curious about the situation. Instead of just saying you're sorry for messing up, you start wondering what hidden rule the mistake revealed. And that is exactly how you find the leaps that nobody else is brave enough to take. Everything you've worked on internally finally comes together right here. Once you process the mistake privately, you have to figure out how to communicate it to your boss, your team, or even your clients. The third step is called the leap, and it's the moment you decide to drop the perfect expert act for good so you can use your failure as a strategic advantage. Instead of leading with a mistake and sounding defensive, you lead with the insight you gained. You might say something like, I tried this specific approach on the project, and while it didn't give us the results we wanted, it actually revealed that our audience cares way more about this other factor. And when you frame it this way, the initial strategy becomes a necessary test that gathers field intelligence rather than a personal shortcoming. You aren't the problem in this scenario. You're the person who just discovered the data needed to pivot toward a winning strategy. I use this exact method now when I tell my blood bank story because leading with that failure builds more trust than a perfect resume ever could. It shows people that I'm secure enough to admit where I messed up and smart enough to have actually learned something useful from the wreckage. That is the essence of the leap. You take that extracted insight and use it to build your next move publicly and confidently, ensuring you aren't just hoping nobody noticed the mistake. You're actually using that failure as a literal foundation for your next big idea. This is your new 3-step playbook for handling the unexpected. First, you perform the autopsy by asking what the failure revealed instead of looking for someone to blame. Second, you extract the one strategic lesson that only this specific screw-up could have taught you. And third, you take the leap by communicating that insight as the very reason for your next confident move. The goal here shifts completely because you aren't trying to avoid failure anymore. You're trying to get so good at learning from it that you start seeing every misstep as your best source for forced innovation. Try putting this protocol to work with one small failure this week, and you'll notice you start communicating with much more clarity and significantly less fear. Stop trying to protect the image. Start protecting the lesson. Because the people who win aren't the ones who never mess up. They're the ones who know exactly how to pivot when they do. That's all for today. Remember, we're looking for progress, not perfection. Be sure to visit speakingwithconfidencepodcast.com to get your free ebook, The Top 21 Challenges for Public Speakers and How to Overcome Them. You can also register for the Formula for Public Speaking course. Always remember, your voice has the power to change the world. We'll talk to you next time. Take care.